Nova Scribes. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Marsha Acker. Marsha is the founder and the CEO of Team Catapult, which is a respected and sought-after leadership development firm that equips leaders at all levels to facilitate and lead sustainable behavioral change. She partners with leaders and leadership teams to clarify their desired change, to develop communicative competence, and to think together, accessing their collective intelligence to bring about change. Marsha is an executive and leadership coach. She's an author, a speaker, a facilitator, and she is the host of the Defining Moments of Leadership podcast. Marsha is unparalleled at helping leaders identify and break through their stuck patterns of communication that get in their way towards high performance. She is internationally known as a facilitator of meaningful conversations. She's a host of dialogue, and she is a passionate analyst. She is also the author of Build Your Leadership Model for Leading Change, Build Your Model for Leading Change, a guided workbook to catalyze clarity and confidence in leading yourself and others. And Marsha, now, welcome to Nova Scribes. I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Brian. I'm excited to be here. And I do have, so the way that we'll go today is I've got a little bit of content that I want to layer in. And we're a small enough group that I'd love for us to also have some conversations along the way. So we'll just sort of to set the frame about what we'll do. And I'll share my screen. Things will pop around and then hopefully you'll be able to see that. So I'm really curious, just by a show of hands, either raising your hand or a Zoom hand. I'm curious, so if I said to you, hey, change is coming, how many of you get excited when you hear change is coming in your organization? So some hands, some, yeah. So here's another question, which is, how many of you get excited when you tell others about a change that you're proposing? Yeah, so there's a little more, and then there's two where there maybe wasn't one. I ask these questions because it helps us kind of get our heads in the space of thinking about change. And I think change is complex. So it's happening all the time, and it's often happening at multiple levels. So the individual level, team level, group level, all the way up to the whole systemic level. And what's happening is our change experience will be unique to each of us. So we'll likely all be in a very different place or some space of sort of letting something go, letting the old go and leaning into the new. And so if change is complex, and then the other piece that will be happening is how we relate to change. We'll all relate to it differently. Some of that can be influenced by our role. Are we the ones suggesting the change, or are we the ones receiving someone else's change? But there's also a process, a letting go process that happens in that place. So if change is complex, it's happening at multiple levels, and it's shaped by the role that we're playing and what's happening and how we interact with one another, then that leaves us with two questions, maybe more than two, but two for today. The first one is, how does change happen? How do we believe that change happens? And then what makes that change sustainable? And so today, I want to challenge you to think more deeply about those answers for yourself. So I am not going to, as Brian alluded to earlier, I'm not going to provide you the answers. But I do hope that tonight we'll actually do some, maybe just sort of priming the pump or getting your thinking rolling about what's your model for leading sustainable change. So that's a little bit of the direction of where I thought we'd go today. I'd say, so all of that Brian just told you, this is a little bit about some of my certifications. So I, in addition to being a leadership and team coach, I often say I got here through a very circuitous route. So my career, my first career, I was in software engineering. And I spent a lot of time bridging the gap between end users and developers. And it wasn't until, so this was about 30 years ago, that I went off to my first facilitation class. And it so profoundly changed how I thought about working with others, how I thought about even at home, how I thought about leadership. So facilitation, I often say, is definitely in my DNA. It became a part of how I think about leading and working with others, and it certainly impacted every aspect of my life. But more importantly, it started what will likely be a lifelong journey of helping leaders work with other humans and navigate the complexities and really these hidden dynamics that show up in our conversations when we're trying to lead, when we're trying to change or bring about change. And so I'm so passionate about it. And yes, structural dynamics, I think, is probably one of the most complete models that I've run across about how to make sense of all of that. So before we go on to the next thing, I want to tell you a brief story. So I learned facilitation about 30 years ago, and about 20 years ago, I was facilitating a senior leadership team through a huge transformation initiative. So there was no part of the organization that was going to remain the same. Not the locations, not the job functions. I mean, it was a little bit like everything was going to be picked up and shuffled around. And at the time, my model for leading change was heavily focused in process. So I held this belief that if you clearly define the process, you get the whole organization involved. You would have heard me say things like, people, getting people's fingerprints on it, people will support what they help to create. All of that, really highly informed my model at that time. And that would lead to successful change. And so in the senior leadership team, we'd been mapping out processes for months, and they had done this phenomenal job of looking for efficiencies, and it had come time for them to make some really difficult final decisions about where they were going to go. And this is where they became stuck. So all the forward momentum that we had came to a halt. And the leadership team meetings started to become really heated. They started circling back on previous decisions. They started questioning the data. Now, mind you, this is data that they had helped create. They knew where it came from. But all of a sudden, they started blaming one another, poking holes in things, finger pointing. And it was all just this feeling of derailing decision-making, derailing that final decision. And overall just generally stuck. And so then at that time, the leader did what most leaders do in these situations. She became super frustrated. She's like, look, fine, I'm going to make the final decision, and it's going to be your job to comply. And we're not going to continue with this process of hearing all voices. I don't think we can collectively do it anymore. And I felt like at that moment that I had completely failed them. We were in what had been multiple retreats. We were up in the mountains of New Hampshire. And I remember taking a walk and just thinking, what more is in my toolbox? Like, what's the next thing that I can try? What's going to help them move forward? But the problem is that my focus was so heavily on the process. And, we were talking about my podcast, but this was a defining moment for me. And it was a moment where I realized that my model for change was incomplete. And it did not account for behavior change and the very individual and sort of human level that a team needs to talk about or experience in order to make it a more complete view about how they're working through change. So with that story, I'm curious, how many of you can identify with this feeling of stuckness and change? So it might be a current project, it might be something that you worked on, a year ago, 10 years ago, but I'm just curious, if you can locate that feeling of stuckness around change. Yeah. So you're not alone. I think many of us get there. And um, there's, I want to layer in some things today about how we think about stuckness and actually how we can use it as a sign or a signal that something needs to change or something else is needed. Or possibly there's something about our model for how we lead change that we need to unpack a little bit more. So that's kind of where we're going to go. Before we dive into the model piece, though, I want to set some context. So I think that and you'll hear bits and pieces today about how I think about change. But I think this question about why do we get stuck, I think some of it comes to, at least here in the US, our work cultures are quite focused on speed and efficiency. If you walk in any organization, at some point you are going to hear about we need to do more with less, we need to do it faster, more efficient, and change is constant. I mean, even external pressures for change. So we spend what I think this does is it sets us up to spend more of our time actually in monologue and less dialogue. And in some ways, this need for efficiency, we sort of manage out the voice of opposition. And when we can't oppose an idea or offer a different perspective, then we do other things that sort of undermine change that's happening. And it sets us up, you know, I often say silence means many things, but consent isn't one of them. And now years ago, I would have said silence does mean consent. That was absolutely, again, it was another belief that I held in how I facilitated. What I know now is that if you're not hearing dissent or you're not hearing different points of view, it's actually setting us up for hidden dynamics in groups. And it's these hidden dynamics that set us up for research that continually year over year points to the fact that change is hard. And I believe that it requires a different skill set from us as leaders than the ones we employ today. So, you know, that story of the leader that just said, you know, get on board, this is where we're going. I think I'm sure all of you have heard the quote about McKinsey's research that shows like 70% of change initiatives fail. You know, that's a fairly frequently quoted statistic. This research actually comes from the Business Agility Institute, and it was published last year. And it showed that change leadership and resistance to change are at the top two of the challenges to transformation. And if you click on, if you kind of double click on what came up or how those themes emerged, what the research showed was that resistance to change often comes from the way it's communicated, how people are communicating about it. And the piece about ineffective change leadership really comes from a couple of sources. One is when the stakes rise for us in systems, and there's no lack of, we don't have to look far to find events that create high stakes. But when those stakes rise, we backslide to old habits really quickly. So the high stakes actually has us backslide. And the second piece of this is that leaders lack kind of the attitude, aptitude, or skills to create the conditions for change. So at some point, we go from being the person who makes things happen or who actually implements things, it gets them done. And really the task becomes for leaders to create the conditions for change, to create the environment, the place where we can think together and talk together about it. And then the third one was that programs lack funding or support, which I think often, you know, weaves back into the other two. What we would add, certainly from our experience at Team Catapult, is two other things that provide a little bit more finer piece on this data. And I see this all the time. The first one is lack of alignment around how change happens. So leaders are often not aligned on this, and it sends them into debates over how to lead change initiatives. So you find them kind of working at odds with one another. One department wants to do it this way, another department wants to do it that way. I literally, just about 3 hours ago, got off of a coaching call with a leader who had this very thing happening for her in the organization. And she's been charged with leading a change. She's at odds with another peer, a counter leader. And they are really debating about how to best do this. And so what we unpacked after just a few minutes is that actually they both have different models for leading change. And they are stuck in the clash of how those models happen. What's helping them is the next piece, which is I find over and over again that leaders overuse monologue, which is the talking at someone, at the expense of dialogue, which is where they would talk with. And I think this happens for a lot of reasons. The leader that I was just talking to, it's amazing, honestly, what's happening for them, but they are taking time. It's taken them multiple weeks to sit down and have this conversation that actually helps them unpack what they're both pointing to and why they're finding themselves at odds. But I think a lot of times leaders don't like hearing dissenting viewpoints, not because they don't value what someone is saying, but it's hard to hear the critique because they don't know what to do with the critique. And they end up simply defending their decision, or they just avoid the different viewpoints. So they manage all of that dissent or differing viewpoints out of the room. So what happens when dissent leaves the room? It does not go away. It just goes underground. So we can push it out of the meeting, and then it shows up with things like we hear the complaints all the time, right? People won't come to meetings, or no one speaks during our calls, or people say one thing when we come together, but they do the opposite outside of the meeting. So they're all choices that we make as leaders. And I think part of it is, how are we conversing with one another? And then where do we get aligned or not aligned on the things that we are talking about? And what do we do with dissent? So that certainly comes from a lot of our experience. And then what that sets us up to do is everybody's favorite game of whack-a-mole, because without the ability to sit down and talk about our model, or to talk about how we're communicating or setting up the conditions for change, it leads us to play the game of whack-a-mole, where we end up solving for the wrong problems. So the leader that I was telling you about actually just a few hours ago was lamenting the fact that they've spent months trying to bring about change, and they've tried all of the other things. And dialogue has sort of become the last ditch effort. I would love it if it could become the first effort, and possibly not take so long to move through things. So I don't think we need any more data to keep telling us that change is hard, but I do think what we need is a clear way to make visible to ourselves and to others how we think about change. And I think these, being able to create these experiences help us get at the heart of how, it's not necessarily an easy process, I think, to be able to tell you why we do what we do. I think many of us can tell you what we do, but I don't know that we really slow down enough to think about why, or to be able to articulate why we do what we do. And we often can make up stories about why others are doing what they do, but I'm not sure that we slow down enough to ask what that might be. And so these are questions that I think really become, move to the forefront. So what I hope today is that I want to get you started on being able to articulate your model for change. I think we all have a model. I think very few of us have just stopped to think about it. So you have one. And I think it's our lack of clarity about this that often leads us to get stuck. And then we do that thing, right? I don't know about your parents, but my parents taught me really well. It's the version where we just say, just do it because I told you to. It's the leader that I told you about in the transformation initiative. We reach our point where we're like, I've got deadlines. There are expectations of me, and I can't wait for us to sort it out any longer. So it's not that that's wrong. I don't want to leave that impression, because sometimes that is what needs to happen. But I think it becomes our default, or sort of the reactive place that we go to. And so there are other ways. That's what we're going to explore. So get clear about articulating your model. understand the 4 components of model building. So I'll talk briefly about that. And then we're going to dive into we're going to have some conversation around how do you believe change happens? And then what's your roadmap for continuing to define your model for change? So I guess maybe the other disappointing part is we're not going to finish today. It's sort of a, life's work should you choose to accept it. So let me talk just briefly about, I keep using this word model. So that can mean many things, but I'll share what I believe that to be. And a lot of this work comes from David Cantor's model for structural dynamics. So Brian mentioned that it's in a book called Reading the Room by David Cantor. So so much of what I'm talking about today is directly sourced from David's research. So when I say model, what I mean is it's a set of beliefs that inform how we think about what we do, why we do it, and how we think it should be done. So the work of building your model for leading change actually lies at the intersection of a couple of core models that we as leaders need to, I hold, that we as leaders need to have in operation before we begin to think about sharing it with others. And so at the very course is in the blue circle. So there's this picture there with 3, the Venn diagram of the blue, green, and yellow circles. So the blue one is your behavioral model. And this is really, this is all in the book, Building Your Model for Leading Change. This is the heart of structural dynamics. So it's about having a language and a way to talk about and think about behavior. But the big question around the behavioral model is, why do I do the things that I do? Why do I react a certain way? Why do I behave a certain way? And so how the behavioral piece is really a core component to that. And then the yellow is the primary question about the yellow is your leadership model. And it asks you to think about what are your core beliefs about what leadership should look like and how you should show up as a leader. And then the green circle is your model for living. And this gets at the heart of what do you believe about what makes a life worth living? What does that look like? What would your daily actions be? What would your mindset look like? How would you align with that? And so these 3 questions really sit at the core. I think about it as the very solid ground where you place your feet when you are leading change. And it's the intersection of the behavior, the leadership, and how we live that really forms that, the kind of core foundation. And that sets us up for a conversation at the very top of that, which is what's the heart of change for us? How do we believe change happens? How do we bring about change? And what's the thing that we're focused on? And David would always say that every model has its limitations. Our job is to be able to name ours. So it's a variation, right, of, every model is wrong. But I really love the way of thinking about no model is right. And I think David would often say the only wrong model is the one that asserts it's the only way. So I think about any time, and it's easy to fall into this place, particularly in model clash, where you run into people who see things so completely differently. But those are the places just to remember that no model is wrong. Every model has its limitations, and our job is to be able to find the limitations of ours and to be able to articulate them. So we'll talk about a couple of these components, and I actually have a link to a PDF with some slides in it that you can follow along, and that might be helpful. I just put the link in the Zoom chat. So let me know if you have any trouble getting to it. That's a Google Drive directory that should be open, but you never know. Technology. Is anyone having trouble? You're in. Great, Nancy, thanks. Okay, just wanted to make sure it works. So if you open that up, you'll see these are some excerpts from the book. So I just wanted you to have them as reference. But if you turn to that first page, it'll actually have page 279 at the very bottom of it, but it'll say building your model for leading change, and you'll see the 4 green circles. So I want to just talk briefly about the components of this. We're not going to spend a great deal of time on it, but just so you have a concept of it. in each model, so as we talk about building your model for change, it's going to have 4 things. The first component is going to be what David calls the theory of the thing. And the thing is the place where you are focused. So your model might be, you might focus on team development, or you might focus on organizational culture, or you might focus on process. So you get to have a thing that you're focused on. And as soon as you determine your thing, then the next question is going to be, okay, so how does change happen in your thing? Change happens in a lot of different ways. There are thousands of models about change. None are wrong. It's more about what do you believe about how change happens for that thing. And then the third thing would be theory of practice, which is based on how that thing changes. How do you go about bringing about change? What are the things that you would take action on? And then the fourth one is your model in practice, which is what do you actually do in the room to make change happen? So if you think about bringing all of those components together, it comes together in a picture like this. So I like to think about the items on the right are our theory, and the one on our left is our model in practice. And that's what happens when all of our thinking and our theories and what we think should happen when it meets the real world. And then when things meet the real world, they get constrained. Things I've been at this for many years. I have yet to walk into any kind of situation and have things go exactly as I would like them to go, right as I had them planned out. So I often say high interest, low attachment. So be highly vested in the purpose and the outcome that people want to have, and really low attachment to things absolutely having to go my way. But if you think about, the theory of the thing will inform how we think about bringing about change, what we think should happen in the room, and then we go to apply it. And then what happens is it gets constrained. People offer opposition, they offer different points of view, or I encounter a different culture with a team, or something failed and it didn't go well, or we start to have conversations, or I do my own reflection. But regardless, there are forces, it's the force field of what's happening to your model in practice. And then those adaptions come back into your model. And it's where you get an opportunity to think. In Team Catapult, we often have model building conversations where we'll say, hey, this happened, or we're learning this, we're noticing this pattern is occurring. Does it, though, change our model? And that's, I think, a really critical question, is just because it's happening, does it mean that our model needs to change, or it just means that we need to adapt in the moment? So I think it's a really helpful way to think about how do we adapt to what's happening. So that's a little bit of an introduction to the theory of model building. And I actually want to move us away from the theory now. And I want to take you to more applications. So we're going to start with this concept of the thing. And in your handout there, if you can flip to page 296 is what it says on the bottom, but it says there's a big blank space, and it might be helpful to have a piece of paper or a blank sheet of paper that you've got next to you, and to think about what is the thing that's in your model. So and if you likely have multiple models, so for the sake of today, let's just pick one. One that maybe is front of mind for you, or something that you're working on. But what is the thing? What is the focus or the subject of your model? And so you heard me share early on in my experience, my focus was on large organizational change. That was my thing. And I believed that the way you bring about large organizational change was by focusing on process. And so my earlier model for org change was often focused on process. Your focus might be different. It might be behavior or culture or leadership or coaching. So I'm going to give you just a moment. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see one another. And I'm going to invite you to take just a minute or two. And then we're a small enough group. I'm not sure that we need to do any kind of breakout conversation for this, but I'm wondering if we could just have, I'd love to have a few of you share, just because it prompts all of us to think differently. have a share. So let me stop talking so you can think for a minute. So just take 2 minutes and think about what's your thing. Okay, so let's hear from some of you. What's the thing that you're focused on? By the way, you can't get this wrong. Is anyone willing to share?
I'll share.
Thanks, Lyle.
This may be wrong, but we'll see. Uh, Part of my model is helping create an environment where people get to their own aha moment, where the light bulb really goes on. And one of the pieces that informs that right now is I've been reading a lot about liminality and how liminality is a new, get used to this, folks, because change isn't a thing that you get through.
Yeah.
And you move on.
Yeah.
So build those liminality muscles. So I've been playing with kind of that aha moment in that liminal, in the messy middle.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So your focus is on liminality.
And some aha moment that moves you beyond, so you don't just feel like you're there forever.
I wonder if your focus might be on mindset or thinking. So I don't know. I'm offering some things to think about, and as we go through today, like maybe just play around with where the focus might be, and liminality might be part of how you believe change happens.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm especially interested in making ideas and information clear, useful, and engaging for people from their perspective. So.
Yeah, I hear a real focus on people's thinking, and yeah, and there might be a little bit more connected to that. So yeah, just make some notes for yourself, because yeah, we'll keep going. Thanks for sharing. Nice. Yeah. Anyone else willing to share?
I'll share one if that's okay.
Yeah.
Although I saw Karen went off mute. Karen, do you want to go first?
Helping people understand purpose so that they're connected and engaged, and then having the metrics in place that tell leadership that yes, we're moving forward. And what comes to mind for me, Marsha, is like the difference. Like, you are brought in for that. I am brought in as an organizational change management lead, not with the expectations of having that reflective opportunity, which I feel is very powerful. So there is my predicament, because we do have, again, our origin stories.
Yeah.
And if we don't understand it, we're going to stick with them. And I had an aha moment because I was in, your video, how to read the room, get outcomes earlier today. I have allergies, so I felt like an idiot. Oh, she's going to be here tonight. I just totally allergied out. But I took the time and got the aha moment. However, how hard is it to have clients that are going to take the time and be open to that aha moment? So that is what I'd like to get
yeah, so your focus is on what would you say your focus is on at the moment?
Well, I think the focus on organizational change is to make sure that the project's going forward
Yeah.
and everybody's going to do what they need to do and contribute what they need to contribute.
Yeah.
And understanding the underlying dynamics that you were talking about, you know, hasn't been part of the equation for success.
Yeah.
I acknowledge that it is very much a critical part of the equation. And even I was in a meditation group, and these are people who are looking into themselves.
Yeah.
And then what? Stop. When you get to that reflective moment, nope, I'm out.
Yes. It's so I love it because I think what I hear you saying, you tell me if I'm wrong, is that yeah, great, I get it. Like I see that this is about a bigger piece and the hidden dynamics. And how in the world do I say that to the people who are focused on efficiency and effectiveness and deadlines?
Exactly, right.
So a healthy dose of I get it, and I'm skeptical about how to say this or invite clients into the process.
How to what?
How to invite clients into that process.
Right. Okay. I'm not skeptical. I mean, I would love it, but it just doesn't seem that it hasn't been my experience. And you know, they're stuck and they're gonna stay stuck.
Yeah.
It's like Captain Ahab. He's going down with a whale.
Perfect. Karen, thanks for sharing.
Okay.
Brian, what were you gonna say?
I just want to do a light touch on this because it's so complex. I have been struggling to help my clients wrap their heads around the complexity of the systems that they're in. And I am looking for a simple graphic model that easily articulates all of the complexities, which include the polarities of different forces believing different things. So for example, there's the tendency to be more agile. And then there's the tendency, the polarity against that, which is to be more secure, right? There's a risk tolerance that's there. So I haven't yet found, I think, a model that I think articulates all of the nuances of systems complexity yet. And I wish there was some sort of like easy graphic that discovered that. So when I went through your book, which is all about like model design, right? This is the thing. Oh man, maybe this will help me draw that model I've always wanted to draw.
Nice. So you're focused on the system, it sounds like. Like there's a focus on the whole, the full systemic view, of change. Nice. Fantastic. So just notice where people are focused. And even as we talk about it here, like there's three, and I've shared a fourth point of view. There's just 4 points of view, and just notice the difference in even where we're placing our focus. So Brian, full system. Lil, maybe the mindset piece about it. Karen, maybe a whole org. That could be the whole system, or it might be a subcomponent of a whole system, right? So there's even complexities if we talk about it here. And if we started to engage in a conversation about how change happens, just notice that it likely would be different because even as we all talk about it, we're pointing to something different. We're each focused on a different part of change. And so I think the first step in navigating this whole aspect of change and its complexity is, where are we looking? Where are we focused? What are we looking at? And then the next question will be, and how do we think change comes about there? So yes, this is part one. Like, where do you place your focus? So let's step down into a next piece. And so if you, I'm gonna share my slides again. And this one might be helpful if we did breakouts, Brian. So I'll let you think about that. But the next piece, I want to give you just a few minutes for exploring metaphors. I love the concept of metaphors because I think it's through metaphors that we can see things that we might not fully have a lot of clarity on if we were to just write it out or answer the question. So we're going to start by thinking about your metaphor for change. I think we all have a metaphor that we might use for change. And it would likely be helpful even if we were just to divide up into pairs and have a brief conversation about this. And here's how it could go. So each person would need to complete this sentence. Change is like. Change is like. Change is like butterfly, a boulder, a mountain, a raindrop. So what is your metaphor for change? And then in your pairs, if your thinking partner would be really helpful if you would ask, so if Brian and I were working together, for example, I might say to Brian, change is like Brian, and you would fill that statement out. And then I would ask you some more questions like, how do you believe change happens in that thing? And what's your role in bringing about that change? And what makes change successful? And so if you could have that paired conversation, the instructions for this, if you're open to that handout, are on page 274, where it says exploring your metaphor for change. This is an exercise that's in the book. So change is like is in the middle of the page. And then there's some questions below that that you can help your partner. So we're looking for the outcome of this is, what's your metaphor? And what does the metaphor tell you about how do you relate to change, your role in that change? So does that make sense? Fantastic.
How long would you like the breakouts to go for?
Let's time check. How about, can we do 6 minutes?
6 minutes. So it's about 3 minutes each.
Yes.
All right. And ready when you are.
Perfect. Let's do it. Welcome back. What did you discover? I would love to hear some metaphors, if you're willing to share.
I think you ought to get Karen to share her metaphor because I really liked it.
Ah.
Well, it's
No
very
pressure.
interesting because although it seemed very different at first, like I said, what came to mind is like a little chick pecking its way out of its shell and exploring like a new world, to have that kind of mindset.
Yeah.
And Leah was saying liminality. And I said, I've never even heard of that word. She said, it's an in-between place, on a threshold, leaving one place and going to another. I said, just like the chick, right? So, it seems like that is the place where you're getting your people and yourself open to be, going from that one in the shell to a new environment that they've never experienced before.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Did you talk at all? Did either of you talk about like your role in it? Where would you place yourself, or where would you find yourself in that? No.
No, because I think that's the next step for me to try when you're talking about, joining a project.
Yeah.
Do you even get the opportunity to have that conversation? You kind of have to be in there and see to what extent that the stakeholders are open to it. And I would assume that, your book has, venues, pathways for that.
The book has questions.
Right.
It has very little answers. I know. So that's a warning, right? That like it might be woefully disappointing if you're searching for answers. But Karen, I would say to you, there's just something a little bit about what I'm hearing as you share that metaphor, that there might, like you might, I'm hearing that you might place yourself a little bit on the outside and maybe observing, or part of a process, but not necessarily, at a place where you're impacting that process. Is that true? So it might be on the periphery.
Purpose of organizational change is to try and, impact the process.
Yeah.
So again, I'm here to get unstuck from the mud of my thinking to then in turn work with clients to do that.
Yep. So some reflection of leaving here today around your chick. Like I love the chick, and I love you finding the themes between you and Lael. And so it might be to think about, yes, there's transition from one place to another, and there's exploration and there's newness. I'm also like, you could riff on it a little bit more, that there might be darkness, not complete darkness, I make up, not complete darkness in the shell, but there might be some darkness. And then it could be, opening your eyes to something new. And I think the place to think about is, where would you place yourself in that metaphor? What would your role be in that metaphor? And that might take a little bit more reflection and thinking. Like, are you separate from it, or are you in it, or are you part of it, or are you helping in some way? And so that would just be something to continue to think about.
Well, I mean, finding the right questions, to make it comfortable and intriguing and exciting, and not scary.
Yeah. Nice. So there's a process by which you're inviting different thinking, or helping somebody explore the difference between the darker piece and maybe the lighter piece.
Yeah, and staying in the shell and breaking out, right? Because you have a very closed world in that shell. And, the baby only has so much time to live in that shell. The yolk, right, is going to be eventually.
So there's time pressure here.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Nice. Thank you for sharing. Yeah. Anyone else have one? I know it's maybe a little vulnerable to share your metaphors, but it's so helpful for all of us to hear. There's an inspirational aspect of this that it's helpful to hear the way other people think about it. So, Karen.
Looks like Karen's got one.
So I was talking with Christina, and my metaphor is simply something growing, like a blade of grass growing. But where I was going with that is, what makes something grow? It's either something negative acting on it, or something that it's being drawn towards. So if it's growing and something's in the way, it has to go around that, whether it wants to or not.
Yeah.
Or it's attracted to the sun. So there's something pulling it, or there's something that's causing some kind of pain. Let's put it that way. And so Christina and I were talking about an experience a change that had to come from a painful place, as opposed to something that was like leading. So Christina can add if she wants to add on that. But
nice.
But yeah, that's what I was thinking. That's as far as we got. Anyway.
Nice. Christina, would you add anything?
What's funny about what Karen said is that we're currently growing an avocado on the windowsill, and every day we have to turn it because it leans towards the sun. But the thing that I was talking about is that my very first change gig was during the pandemic. And because there were legislative changes and things going on, we were forcing through a change, which from the organizational perspective was actually straightforward and simple. From the perspective of the people using it in the environment that they found themselves in, the change was actually quite painful, because they were in a tight time frame. It was getting it wrong was a huge penalty, and those kinds of things. So it just it wasn't a good thing to watch. Probably really good to be involved and see it, but it wasn't as easy from the user perspective as it was from the organization's perspective. So to me, it was a very painful thing, and it struck me
Yeah.
very much like toothache. It was really
Yeah.
good when it stopped.
I was about to ask you, I was like, what's your metaphor for it? Yeah.
For that
think-
one, it was toothache.
Toothache, yeah. I'm really appreciating the contrast in even just hearing the different metaphors, because, and like, I think the metaphors that come up for us give us insight into how we think about change, how we relate to it. The questions like, what kind of energy does it bring? Does it, is it newness or is it painful? The contrast between Karen and Christina, the two that you're sharing, and to how we relate to it will be like, they're just really rich places to kind of continue to mine how we think about it. Brian, were you willing to share yours just briefly?
Sure, why not?
Yeah.
So I said, with a little bit of help and coaching, change is like a coral reef. It is organic. It follows rules of physics and of life's possibilities. It is constant and it is sensitive to environmental impact. Change happens by individual and colonies of organizations pursuing their own energy, finding harmony and balance with the organisms around them. When Marsha asked me, what is my role? I had to think about this one for a second, but I said, you know what? I think I'm the scuba diver. So I'm external, I'm viewing, I'm appreciating, I'm learning from it.
Yeah. Thank you. It's great. I think that the question about what's our role in it, it's super hard. So because I'm not sure that we spend, again, I go back to, I'm not sure that we spend a lot of time thinking about it. But I'd really encourage each of you to think about, like, how would you describe your role in it? Are you external to it? Are you watching it? Do you feel like it's being done to you? Does it bring you energy, or does it just suck energy out? The metaphor even of just the talk of stuck in the mud, like that has its own, like, think about the energy around that. It's clogged up, like hard, difficult. I used to describe change as, like, I felt like I was pulling people up a mountain or dragging something with like really heavy weights on it. So if you describe it that way, and like, there's a lot in that metaphor as I use it. I'm dragging weights. So anytime I feel like I'm dragging something is a key indicator for me now that there's something fundamentally mixed up for me about how I'm thinking about change. Because if I feel like I'm doing all the heavy lifting or I'm doing all the work, then it's become my agenda or my thing. And somehow that's work for me to do, to flip it around, so that it becomes someone else's change. They're the thing that they want. So just ways to think about playing with metaphor. Yeah, Karen.
Was wondering if you might talk a little bit about, I'm thinking about role. And in the conversation with Christina, this came up for me is, what if our role is one where we feel like we have control versus a role where we feel like we don't have control? Like something is we're being made to do the change versus we have an impact and we can choose how we do this.
Yeah. I think if it comes up for you that you feel like change is being done to you, then that's something to explore. Like, is it helpful for you to have that perspective? Or is there something about that that just doesn't feel great, that doesn't bring a lot of energy? And so thinking about how you might shift it. So many times I think in large organizational change, there will absolutely be things that are decided that you might not have had your fingerprints on. But are there ways that you can shift a portion of that to think about how you might take action on the sphere of influence that you do have? Like, so I think anytime we're looking at those things, how can we shift our energy? How can we shift our perspective? Because, dragging something through mud or being the victim of something is not life-giving, inspiring, or energizing. And so thinking about how, if that's the metaphor that comes up for you, it's not that you're wrong. It's that there's maybe an opportunity to think about shifting your perspective or how you're thinking about change or what your focus is on. So if I'm focused on how do I bring about large organizational system change, but I'm in the company and I'm employed and I work here and I'm 4, 5, 7 levels down from the very top decision maker, that my focus might need to be someplace else, because if I keep thinking about this, that can feel overwhelming and like I'm, change is being done to me rather than I'm participating in it. So that might be a shift in thinking about the thing that we're focused on. So there are things within my sphere of influence. There are things where I can demonstrate leadership and take action. So there's an invitation, I think, to think about metaphors and where it brings us energy versus where it sort of sucks energy. Nice. So this is an ongoing exploration. It's an opportunity to think about what's working, what's serving you, maybe what's not serving you so well, and how can you imagine a different perspective or viewpoint. So I'll share my slides again and just sort of wrapping up. I want to share with you, this is actually our model for leading change at Team Catapult. And remember the transformation that I shared with you at the beginning that became stuck. They were stuck because nowhere in the process of talking about change had we created a space for them to process their concerns and talk about the personal impacts that was going to affect them and their teams. And so it was in that moment, I told you I went for my walk around in the mountains of New Hampshire. It was really in that very moment that I had a realization about the importance of individuals and system level coaching inside of a change effort, not just facilitation. And it forever changed my approach to change. So in that particular initiative, we just started creating different spaces for the leadership team to talk about different aspects, personal aspects of where they disagreed with the change. It didn't necessarily mean that they were going to influence the total outcome, but it did allow them to name the things that had actually gone offline and out of the room. And so it was by shifting that, those kinds of conversations that really started to make a difference. So one of the things that sits in our model for change at Team Catapult, and this is ongoing, I think it's never ending, it's always evolving for us, but much of some of my early learning sits in this model. And I'm not sharing this with you as the right model or the only model, it is a model. And I'm simply doing it as a way to maybe spark your thinking. But I just really want to emphasize this is not the answer. It is just what works for us in this particular moment in time. So in our model for change, we focus on behavior. That is our primary thing that we focus on. And we believe that sustainable behavior change happens through dialogue and effective conversations. So you will have heard me sprinkling this through in various ways. It's how I think about things. And so our focus, because we believe that, our focus becomes creating spaces where we help people think together. And that is where we believe we see perspective and mindset shifts happen. We also believe that no one changes until they feel heard and understood. And that phrase sort of sits at the core of everything that we do when we're working with teams. So the way this starts to play out is our role in change is to equip leaders. This is how we relate to it, is to equip leaders with the skills and practices that enable that effective communication and generative dialogue. And so in practice, in the room, we often start by helping leaders create a shared language in the system and then asking them to practice. This is the tough one. We have teams that we've worked with that spend over 9 months practicing this one thing, which is practice bringing the conversation in the room instead of out of the room, online instead of offline, and then getting the full system in the room, and then coaching teams to notice stuck patterns and take action. So much of our work is about working ourselves out, not creating dependency, helping to create autonomy, and a real belief in the process of conversation and effective dialogue. And this is only a way. So I'll just keep reiterating that. That there's just no one right model, remember, right? So there's only a model and it has limitations. But I think the clarity of it is what's so important. I think there are thousands of ways to bring about change. And I love the models that you all, the metaphors that you all have shared today. So this is just an invitation to think about how to continue to work on your model. So you have some of the slides in the handouts. And then what do you focus on? Where do teams get stuck, or where does your change get stuck? Karen, I hear you like really clearly being able to articulate like where things are getting stuck. And I think there's an opportunity to kind of use that place to keep reflecting on, okay, so it might be that it's an indicator that something's missing or needed. And if that were the case, what might that look like? And then what might be missing from your model? So that's the piece. I think that when we encounter stuckness, our reaction, or kind of our reactive tendency could be to manage it away or fix it. Again, I go back to the leader who was like, done, you're stuck, I'm making the decision and we are moving forward. That's a way to handle it. I would argue that it's not always the most sustainable way. So it's needed sometimes, and I'm not sure that it's most sustainable. So if we use the stuckness part, though, to think of it as a gift, stuckness as a gift, and it's trying to tell us something. It's an indicator that maybe more inquiry or dialogue is needed, and that we need to go from sort of defending our point of view to being curious about what's going on. So a couple of quick tips, I think, as we wrap up today about thinking about how you navigate stuckness. The first, I think, is just to pause and name it. So you might say something like, it sounds like we're stuck, or it sounds like we have different models for change. And then our job is to get curious about it. So the famous line, right? Tell me more. Or how do you believe change happens best? Or what are you focusing on? Or how do you think that we should bring about change? I think any and all questions that bring out curiosity is where you need to go. And then through the curiosity, what we're looking for is finding alignment and difference. So where are we aligned? And then what are our major differences? As I told you the story about the leader who I was coaching just earlier today, the primary difference was actually in how learning happens best. And really honing in on the fact that they had different perspectives on how that happens. So I think when we can do that, it goes from being this really high stakes topic where we're sort of digging in to it just lowers the stakes and everybody goes, oh, I get it. It's just different. We're neither right or wrong. And then deciding how we want to move forward. So I think this question about how do we create more alignment and how do we, what's best going to serve our organization or our team. So those are the key pieces, and finding a way to navigate that. I think when you encounter resistance, it's data. It means that there's something missing. And I'd invite you into a vision that I have for the future, and it's big, particularly here in the US. So Karen, I appreciate you bringing the voice of, change just happening in, because I think that does happen in a lot of organizations. It's like it's almost like sometimes it's a little bit more mechanical. But I have a vision for the future that, and this was actually on the podcast. You can find the woman who was talking about this. There was a leadership team in the UK who used this process of model building. And they started with themselves as a leadership team and started to have conversations about how each of them viewed change, and then how they viewed change happening best. Like, what was the best way for that change to happen across their organization? As a leadership team, they came to an internal alignment about how they wanted to lead a major organizational change And that was the very first step. That was the first thing that they did. And then and only then did they start looking for a consulting firm to help them lead that change. And they looked for a firm that held their same beliefs about how change happened. And that's how they selected the partner that they would have in that change. And I think if we could start to normalize that as part of a change process, the clarity and ease and flow that I think could emerge through a full transformation like that would be immeasurable. And so it might not be, your scope of influence might not be at that level, but I would say I'd invite you to start where you can about how do you want to lead change. And I think when we can get alignment around that, then that becomes the thing that propels us forward and we can make decisions from that. But, so many leadership teams spend time debating and fighting with one another, and it just sort of diffuses all of the energy and the effort. And so I think if we could find ways to normalize this idea of having a conversation about how do we want to lead change and how are we best going to bring that about, then that's the place to focus. So there's a QR code. If you want to know more about reading the room, so more about structural dynamics, this is just a free download that we have that just gives you some of the language for it. And I welcome you to connect with me. The best way is to do that through LinkedIn. And we have a masterclass coming up. If you're interested in the behavioral aspect of this, less about the model building piece, there's 2 dates, April 30th and May 14th. It's just a 3-hour deep dive into structural dynamics. So yeah, and then we can just open up some questions.
And I'm dropping those links into chat. Let's go ahead and stop the recording, then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Yep.
But everybody, please give Marsha a big Nova Scribes. Thank you very much. That was awesome, Marsha.
Thanks.